before we discuss Article 5 for the rest of the evening, I'd like to share the history of the creation of Article 5. Before I begin, though, I feel it's very important to differentiate between a constitutional convention and a convention called under Article 5. So a constitutional convention is for the purpose of creating an entire new constitution. A convention called under Article 5, or a limited amendments convention, is a tool in the U.S. Constitution strictly for the purpose of amending our current Constitution. Quite often these terms are used interchangeably, but they are not an apples-to-apples comparison. So, let's go back in our country's history to a time before the Constitution. How did we exist as a nation without a Constitution? Well, the 13 states were joining a treaty among separate nation-states called the Articles of Confederation. And this time, people thought of themselves more as citizens of Virginia or Pennsylvania more than as Americans. A similar current-day parallel would be the European Union, where separate nations joined together in a treaty on common goals such as defense or commerce. This is evident in the language of the Articles of Confederation. Where in Article 2 it says that each state retains its sovereignty, freedom, and independence. And in Article 3 it says the said states hereby severally enter into a firm league of friendship with each other. So it's also important to remember that there was no convention process in the Articles of Confederation. So the Annapolis Convention and the 1787 Philly Convention didn't happen under the Articles of Confederation. They happened during the Articles of Confederation. They were an informal process. The Annapolis Convention was called in 1786 to deal with trade issues. The Shays' Rebellion, which was viewed as a serious threat to the nation, showed the need for a more fundamental change. Fears of the nation being overthrown were real, and the states knew that there were serious problems in need of revision with the Articles of Federation. So 5 states met in Annapolis to discuss trade and commerce, or at least 4 of the 5 states instructed their delegates as such. The New Jersey delegation was empowered with the authority to, quote, to consider an act that would enable the United States and Congress assembled effectually to provide for the exigencies of the Union, end quote. That terminology, exigencies of the Union, is crucial because the problems with the Articles of Confederation were so serious, the other Annapolis delegates quickly realized they needed the authority that the New Jersey delegates had. So they proposed calling another convention in Philly the following May to do so. And now, what you're looking at is a chart that shows how our founding fathers built Article 5 at the convention in Philadelphia. You can see 3 stages: determination of the needed change, formulation of the actual language, and ratification by the states. You can see 2 parallel routes for each step. So, the first draft of the Constitution was written by James Madison, and is referred to as the Virginia Plan. The plan said the assent of the national legislature ought not to be required to amend the Constitution. While many people view Congress as the first way to amend the Constitution, that's not historically accurate. The first draft left Congress out entirely. George Mason is quoted at the time as saying it would be improper to require the consent of the national legislature because they may have abused their power and refused consent. So the second draft reads as follows. On the application of the legislatures of 2/3 of the states in the Union for an amendment of this Constitution, the legislature of the U.S. shall call a convention for that purpose. Now, if you're thinking that it's missing something, you'd be correct. But while most of you are thinking that's Congress, Eldridge Gerry pointed out that there is no mode of ratification either. And it was at this point that Congress was added, as well as Hamilton arguing for co-equal amending power with Congress. Oh, these slides aren't moving at all, are they?
Yeah, they are.
No, it's just your Hamilton.
Your Hamilton.
The other Hamilton.
Lin-Manuel Miranda.
Yeah.
Oh, okay. So when Madison and the Committee of Style, which, by the way, sounds totally cool, met to draft the third draft of the U.S. Constitution, it looked very similar to today's version, but this time the convention was missing. So Mason argued that no amendment of the proper kind would ever be obtained by the people if the government should become oppressive, which I verily believe will be the case. Madison voiced logistical concerns about a convention, but ultimately he also said the concerns were minor, and he voted with the rest of the framers unanimously to include the convention process in Article 5, giving us the version that we have today. So, after completion, the Philly Convention didn't send the proposal to the states. Also widely misstated, it did not change the ratification process for the Articles of Confederation. This was not a change to the Articles. It was a question of whether the sovereign states wanted to end the Articles and start something new, which was their inherent right. And with no formal authority, Since there was no convention process in the Articles, they sent the proposal to Congress. Congress debated it, and ultimately they sent it off to the states with no recommendations, allowing them to decide whether or not to pull out of their current treaty among sovereign states to form a federal government and a new nation that had co-equal sovereignty along with the states. The first conventions called under the U.S. Constitution were for ratification under Article 7. And a century and a half later, there were the first ever Article 5 ratification conventions to repeal prohibition. Now, Article 7 is the procedure for ratifying the Constitution, and that brings me to the state of New Hampshire and a perfect example of the convention process functioning properly. So, the New Hampshire Convention is a great example because the people of New Hampshire were against the new Constitution, but the legislature was for it. So they held a convention in the middle of a New Hampshire winter in an area that was for the Constitution. And now, in spite of the fact that the Facebook or the CNN equivalent of the time was the Pony Express, the convention was very popular. Everybody knew what was going on. Everybody wanted to know, they wanted to influence that decision. So, this is where it's critical to distinguish between the legal authority between a representative and a delegate. A representative can act as they please, and a delegate must act as they're instructed. So, the New Hampshire delegates were instructed to vote against. But upon arriving and discussing the Constitution, they came to agree with it. But they couldn't change their votes because they were instructed delegates, not representatives. So, they went back to their districts and they began convincing the people about this new Constitution until they were instructed to change their votes. And this brings me to the convention in Poughkeepsie, New York, and back to Alexander Hamilton. New York was debating whether to ratify this new Constitution or to call for a new constitutional convention or even to just stay out of it. But when New Hampshire became the ninth state to ratify, that represented a tipping point in whether a new nation would be formed. And this changed the New York debate whether or not to ratify, and this was a debate that Hamilton felt that he could win. That's why he had a rider waiting in New Hampshire to bring him the news as soon as it was decided. And this allowed Hamilton, John Jay, and others to draft a compromise. The New York Circular Letter was drafted calling to use Article 5 of the newly accepted U.S. Constitution to add amendments they felt lacking to the current document. Now, this list of topics was long, but the convention would be still limited to these topics. And from the letter, quote, "We desire nothing more than that the amendments proposed by this or other states be submitted to the consideration of a general convention." Now, while we commonly today associate a general convention to be a, quote, open convention or convention without limits, it was common in this time period to use general as general attendance. Remember that during this time period, conventions were sometimes held between only a few states, and they wanted all states represented. Now, how did Madison feel about this? He was opposed to the specific convention while still in favor of the mechanism of Article 5, and he didn't want to alter Congress before they had even met and had a chance to decide whether or not to even meet under the Constitution, the new Constitution they had. So if amendments altering the Constitution came this soon, he wanted Congress to propose them. Now, the New York Circular Letter pressured New York and Virginia to call that convention, and this in turn sparked Madison to write what would become the Bill of Rights, as well as the 27th Amendment. Madison went on to argue for the use of Article 5 twice in his career. The first was in 1799, arguing against the Alien Sedition Acts. Madison argued the states could use Article 5 to propose a, quote, explanatory amendment to overrule Congress's interpretation of the First Amendment, and was part of a campaign to elect Thomas Jefferson, which ended the issue. So the second was in 1820 for an amendment on nullification. Madison opposed nullification, and any amendment not overwhelmingly popular would ultimately fail, which it did.